We are continuing our reaction series to Mike Winger's divorce and remarriage teaching. If this is the first episode you're looking at, hit the playlist. It's in the description below. Go back to the first episode, watch from there. By the time you get here, it'll make way more sense. Also, get my book, Divorce Your Remarriage. It's at Amazon.com. I will link to that also in the description below. Let's go for it.
What about a marriage that was infidelity? Should you break up a marriage if you're in a marriage right now and you're like, I shouldn't have got married to that person, that was an immoral act? I think your answer is no. You should not stop that marriage. You shouldn't break it up. It might have been wrong to do, but guess what it is? It's a marriage.
Okay, here in Mike and I completely disagree. Now, before I do this, let me just mention, I think Mike is a good Bible teacher on most subjects most of the time, but I disagree with him on divorce and remarriage, hence this whole series. All right, so we disagree on this very much so. If a man went to his pastor and said that he got a girlfriend on the side, and the pastor says, wait a minute, aren't you married? What do you mean you got a girlfriend on the side? And the man says, yes, I am married. And then let's say the pastor says, your girlfriend, that's adultery. Now, here's my question. Does the pastor have to say, therefore, break up with the girl? Or is it so obvious that the man would have to break up with it because the pastor called it adultery? Wouldn't you know that? I mean, could the man later on say, well, my pastor called it adultery, but he didn't say I had to end the relationship? No, of course, the man couldn't say that, right? So similarly, Jesus calls remarriage as adultery 7 times in the New Testament. He meant for people to break up the adulterous remarriages. Everybody knew that's what Jesus meant. There was no Jewish category for a valid marriage that is adultery. Jesus was teaching that if someone is remarried and their valid spouse is alive, they must divorce their adultery remarriage. Now, Mike is going to argue that the remarriage is a valid marriage because it's called a marriage. There's a Greek word there, and like Matthew 19:9, for example, and marries another. Oh, look, it uses the word marries. Greek word must be a valid marriage, but that is an error. So, let me walk you through this. In Mark chapter 6, the writer refers to Herod's marriage to Herodias as a marriage. But we know that marriage was incestuous, right? It was not a valid marriage. Mark did not think it was a valid marriage, but he called it a marriage anyway. Why did he call it a marriage? Because the words wife and husband and marriage and divorce, they did not convey validity or invalidity. The validity or invalidity is conveyed by the context, not the Greek word. So yes, a remarriage is a marriage in the sense that it's recognized by the state, by the spouses, and by society, but that doesn't mean it's ultimately a valid marriage that's recognized by God. So look at how Jesus uses the word divorce. He says a man divorces his wife and marries another and thereby commits adultery. Obviously, the divorce didn't give moral permission to remarry. The divorce did not end the marriage. If it did, the remarriage couldn't be adultery.
It's a marriage. And to divorce now in the name of the holiness of your first marriage, to divorce the second one, it's contradictory. And I'll give you a few of the reasons for this. Jesus, with the woman at the well, he affirmed that her 5 previous husbands were in fact husbands.
The word husband doesn't convey validity of those marriage. You have to use the context, not the Greek, to determine validity or invalidity. So let me give you an example of this. Another one. In 1 Corinthians 7, 10, and 11, Paul says that a divorced woman could be reconciled to her husband. But wait a minute. How could that be her husband if she's divorced? If her divorce made her not married, then her former husband is not her husband. How then does Paul call him her husband? Are they still married? If they're still married, then when Paul says that they were unmarried, he didn't mean that literally. You can't mean unmarried literally and husband literally. One of those is not literal. And so you have to understand the context. That tells you what's going on there. So Mike's assumption here is common today, but it's wrong. The Greek words do not convey validity, rather the presence of, socially recognized relationship. That's what is being conveyed by the Greek words there.
She's had 5 husbands. So he seems to affirm, again, I mentioned this before, the legitimacy of second, third, fourth, and even fifth marriages. He seems to affirm that. Jesus, again, when he talked about not getting divorced, he says, let not man, take apart, separate what God has joined together. He didn't say cannot. It cannot happen.
Okay, so again, this is an overly literal reading. Matthew 19:6 is what he's talking about here, and there it says, God in reality joined husband and wife, so husband and wife in their lived experience shouldn't separate. He was not teaching that husband and wife, can supernaturally unjoin that which God has supernaturally joined. We know that joining is supernatural, by the way, I should mention this, because before sex was sin, and after the marriage, sex isn't sin. The only way to make that kind of moral change is through a supernatural act, not a natural act. Couldn't do that. So the joining is done supernaturally. God does it. It makes this moral change. And so nobody would have thought they could undo a supernatural act by God. Also, Jesus moments later says remarriage after divorce is adultery. And that indicates that divorce didn't dissolve the first marriage. So that should resolve any ambiguity.
He acknowledged that marrying another was an actual possibility. If you marry another, you commit adultery. Like, it's actually marriage, though. Like, that's the word he used for it. Everybody would assume that it was a real marriage. Another point I want to mention, and I think this is actually pretty significant, is that we would actually expect the Bible to have to break up lots of marriages if this was the teaching, right? When Paul's bringing his radical teachings about marriage into 1 Corinthians 7, why doesn't he say, if you're in the middle of a second marriage and your first spouse is still alive, separate and go be reconciled with them? He never says that. His instruction to whoever you're married to is to just stay married. So where we would expect Paul to mention it, he doesn't. And his instructions on face value would tell you in your second, third, fourth, fifth marriage to just stay married. I think silence in Paul gives weight to accepting those marriages.
Okay, so first thing I want to mention here is Mike just admitted this is an argument from silence, which is a logical fallacy. That's like saying, since the Bible doesn't prohibit a woman from making a choice to get an abortion, therefore abortion is permissible. That's just poor reasoning, though. We have to take biblical principles about the value of life, and we conclude abortion is impermissible. We don't say that silence is approval of the choice of abortion. Similarly, we shouldn't say that silence is approval to continue in adulterous remarriage. Second, Paul does not say, if you're in an adulterous remarriage, stay in the adulterous remarriage, right? Mike is just kind of incorrect on this point. Paul does not address what to do in an adulterous remarriage in 1 Corinthians 7. And Mike just said that. But Mike also then said that Paul was saying to stay in adulterous remarriage. Did you catch that? He said, well, Paul says, stay in the condition you're in, which means stay in adulterous remarriage, but also he doesn't say one way or the other. So it can't be both. He either said it or he didn't say it. And the answer is he did not address it in 1 Corinthians 7. And the reason is because the Corinthians are trying to get out of marriages. They would not have been fighting Paul on the need to divorce an adulterous remarriage. They want to get out of any marriages they can. So he's assuming that the Corinthians here are looking for remarriage instead of what the text shows that they're looking to avoid marriage. So from the Corinthians' perspective, they're ascetic. They want out of marriage, right? If they're in an adulterous remarriage, that's easy. Just get out of the adulterous remarriage. The question then they're asking Paul wasn't about that. It was about, hey, are there other marriages we can get out of? Like, what if I'm married to an unbeliever? Paul says no. Okay, well, what if my unbelieving spouse leaves me? Paul says, okay, well, you can stay unmarried in that particular situation, right? Oh, what if we're already divorced? If you're already divorced, stay unmarried or go back to your first spouse. Those are your options. Okay. So Paul's addressing those kind of situations. There just wouldn't be an occasion to bring up to the Corinthians, oh, you should divorce your adulterous remarriages, because they would have already known that. So that's just kind of an unnecessary thing to be looking for in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. They were talking about other marriages they wanted to get out of. Okay, third, by calling remarriages adultery, Jesus did say to end the adulterous remarriage, right? So every time you see a verse in the epistles that tells people to stop adultery or to stop fornication, you see a verse that says to end adulterous remarriages. Those remarriages would be included in the words adultery and fornication. The confusion Mike and others have on this point has to do with the context of the Gospels versus the epistles. Let me explain this. See, the Gospels record the life and teachings of Jesus, which were in the context of Jewish life and included conversations with non-believers. The epistles are in the context of the Roman Empire and are conversations between the church leaders like Paul and professing believers. So for the Gospels, in the context of Jewish life, for Jesus' audience to understand his meaning, he uses words like divorce and remarriage so his audience understands what he means. Okay, he's using their language so they understand him, right? But when you get to the epistles, the audience is Christians. They've already been taught the basics of the faith, including that remarriages are fake marriages and they're an ongoing state of sexual sin. So it's unnecessary in the epistles to say divorce the remarriage because they know those remarriages are fake marriages. The Gospels include conversations with outsiders. The epistles are conversations with insiders. So additionally, in Rome, you wouldn't need to file for divorce or write up a certificate. You would just separate under the law. You are auto-divorced. Mike is assuming the early church, which read the epistles, viewed these remarriages as real marriages, but they didn't view them that way. These were relationships of sexual sin that needed to end. They weren't actual marriages. You just had to leave. They would call it a marriage, right, before you're saved, and you get saved, and then you get taught all this stuff, and then you get some letters, and it says, flee from fornication, flee from adultery, that kind of stuff. And what does that mean? That means move out of your house with this person with whom you have a fake marriage with. That's what that is talking about. And no, they wouldn't be calling it marriage because they don't think it's marriage. That's the whole point. See, you have to imagine this whole structure, this whole viewpoint in order for it to make sense. You can't impose part of Mike's kind of viewpoint into this other system and go, oh, look, it contradicts. Well, the thing that contradicts is Mike's viewpoint with this whole other way of understanding the New Testament on this subject. So let's have an illustration. Suppose a man and a woman are living together. They have 2 children, and then the man gets saved. And he asks his girlfriend to marry him, and she refuses. We would tell him he has to move out. Now, if she says, we're already married in our own way, we would reject that. We would say, no, you're living in sin, and you need to marry or move out. We wouldn't say, divorce your fake marriage and move out. We would just say, stop the sexual sin. Similarly, in the early church, if they saw people in an adulterous remarriage, they would say, well, that's not a marriage. It's fornication, it's adultery. You got to move out. It's anachronistic to require them to have said divorce. So now all you have to say is end the sexual sin, and that includes, quit living together, and that would end the remarriage. So also divorce at the time was done by just moving out. So Mike mentioned that, earlier, that he just moved out and kind of auto-divorced. So we shouldn't expect to see them writing about divorce certificates when the Roman law didn't require that.
In the Old Testament, second marriages were seen as legitimate, Deuteronomy 24. Wrongful oaths were still binding. This is an interesting.
Okay, so Deuteronomy 24 was a regulation that Jesus said was for hard-heartedness in Matthew 19:8. So recognition of a remarriage as a valid marriage can only be done by concession to human sinfulness. Even in Deuteronomy 24, it says the woman was defiled by her second marriage. Jesus, basically he just overrides the government permission in Deuteronomy 24, and he does that there in Matthew 19:7-8, where he specifically rejects divorce for adultery, Matthew 19:8, and in the next verse, Jesus said remarriage while a prior valid spouse is alive is adultery.
Point. John Piper actually brings this up. Joshua made a wrongful treaty with the Gibeonites, but God still called him to honor the treaty. This is in Joshua 9. The bottom line is this. It's a covenant God said not to make, but God required them to keep it after they made it. That is a wrongful marriage. It was wrong for you to do that. That was even an adulterous act when you got married. But guess what? You're married. Now honor that covenant and now redeem it in the Lord.
Okay, so the treaty with the Gibeonites. Okay, here's the deal with that. That was not intrinsically sinful. That's the main thing. That is, it's not sin to enter into a treaty. Okay, well, the sinful thing was they shouldn't have entered in the treaty with this particular group at that particular time. But the treaty, the idea of a treaty itself is not sinful. But that is not the same thing as a remarriage. Adultery is intrinsically sinful. So this is totally disanalogous. If it was analogous, let's say it was analogous. Let's say that God requires people to keep to their word and keep to their vows, just like he required the Jewish people to keep to their treaty with the Gibeonites. And so let's say that means that if somebody gets remarried, they have to keep to their vows. It was wrong for them to do it. It's adultery, but they have to stay in the remarriage. Okay, if that's true, homosexual marriages also cannot be divorced, right? Because they vowed. Do you take this? Do you take that? Yes, and they vowed. So you have to say that they have to continue their homosexual marriage. Now, obviously, that's a ridiculous conclusion. We can't come to that conclusion, and so we have to make a distinction. And the right distinction to make is a vow to do a stupid thing. Yes, that you have to do. A vow to do a intrinsically sinful thing, that you do not have to continue. In fact, repentance is rejecting one's commitment to sin. So if somebody made a vow to sin and they go to repent, they need to forsake their commitment to sin, which would be forsaking the vow. It would be rejecting repentance to continue a vow to do intrinsically sinful conduct.
Now, David Pawson, I want to mention by name because his teaching is both in video form and in book form. And I've checked out both of them, read his book and everything. He teaches that if you have divorced and remarried and you are still in the second marriage and your first spouse is still alive, you are not only existing in a marriage you shouldn't have, you are in active, constant adultery every day of your life. And you are not going to heaven when you die. Like, you will go to hell because of this rebellion against God. This is David Pawson's teaching. It's extreme. And I was like shocked when I heard it. So he argues a second marriage is not only an adulterous act initially, but it remains continual adultery for the duration of the marriage.
Okay, that's my view. It's also the view of Augustine. Now, Mike calls it extreme, but it's the mainstream view of the vast majority of church history during the last 2,000 years. So Mike's view is actually the view that's outside the mainstream of church history. So now I don't base it on the verb tense, as Mike will go on to explain here. It's just the basic logic of Jesus' teaching. Mike goes on to say that while he strongly disagrees with this view, he views this person as having piety toward the Lord. And so I appreciate Mike. He doesn't treat him with like a heretic or a second-class Christian or anything like that. He just disagrees with his view. And I wish more people who were more on the permissive side on divorce and remarriage could at least follow Mike's example here, instead of treating permanence people like the heretic adjacent, or when in reality, permanence people who have the permanence view of marriage were in the majority of church history by far.
How does he do this? He bases it off of a verb tense in Luke 16:18. Let's walk through it. Here it says, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. Now, according to David Pawson, according to him, I'll just read it to you. This is on page 43 of his book, Remarriage is Adultery Unless. And he says, furthermore, the tense of the verb for committing adultery is the present continuous, which means to go on doing something. Some have tried to say that only the initial act of remarriage and its first physical union is adultery, but Jesus is including all subsequent intercourse. To put it bluntly, remarriage after divorce is bigamy in God's eyes. This is the strongest possible terms. David Pawson talks about a man he met who was in a second marriage and asked him about it. And he told the man he had to pick between heaven and that second marriage because he couldn't have both. This to me is I love his piety, his commitment to the Lord, but it's just wrong. And I think God, it's wrong. But at any rate, let's talk about this. Pawson says that the Greek word for commits adultery is in the present continuous Greek. Now I don't know how well David Pawson knows Greek, but present continuous is probably the wrong description. A better description is present. We all agree with present, right? But it's the mood of the term when you're parsing out a Greek verb. The mood of the term is indicative, not continuous. Indicative is not the same as continuous, and I'll give you some reasons to think why that's the case. Generally speaking, when a Greek verb is used in the present indicative sense, as it is here in Luke 16:18, it does not mean that the action is going on into the future forever and always. That's not the case. Robertson, who, in fact, I have an article in the description below you can read on this whole topic. I'm just going to give you one quote and then we'll move on. But Robertson notes that the most frequent use of the present indicative is in the descriptive present. the simple statement of fact with no specific reference to continuity. The iterative present, which is what Poston wants to suggest it is, involving repetition, is not so frequent. There's an article gets into great detail on this. It's actually way too complicated for this 12, 13-hour long video I'm doing to add that as well. But the article is down there. The reality is that present indicative is not enough to say that the future marriage is a continual act of adultery. You need additional arguments for that in the text. And they give examples of texts that don't even make sense when you think that's what the present indicative means. So anyway, I encourage you to check that out. David Poston is way out on a limb in his declaration that people are not saved if they have a second marriage. Here's my view, for what it's worth. The second
Okay, Possum is not way out on a limb in his conclusion. I don't join him in his reasoning, but in his conclusion, he's not way out on a limb. He is mainstream church history. It's the current view in evangelicalism, actually, that's way out on a limb if you were talking about its comparison to the rest of the church and the way they viewed these verses.
marriage, if it was an unjustified remarriage, if it was an adulterous act, then it breaks the first marriage finally. This is actually consistent with Deuteronomy 24. The woman couldn't go back to the first husband after the second one, right? That there's a breaking of that marriage. You have divorce with adultery now. And so now the new marriage takes precedence. It is a marriage. Even if it started wrong, it's
Okay, so Mike says that the adulterous remarriage breaks the first marriage. So if you interpret porneia and the exception clause to be adultery, the text only allows a man to divorce an unfaithful wife and remarry. It doesn't permit a woman to divorce an unfaithful husband and remarry. So make no mistake about that. The Jews at the time thought the rules for divorce and remarriage were gendered. So they would not have flipped the genders like we think today. My view, again, is that the exception clause is for an invalid marriage. So the idea is that a man married a divorced woman, their marriage is invalid, and therefore, if he divorces her and remarries, he isn't committing adultery since he was never married to her in the first place.
a marriage and it should be preserved. I thought that would actually be pretty important for me to cover David Instone Brewer's work by itself in this survey, since I'm not actually agreeing with his case and using it, but it is a very impactful work. His book, Divorce and Remarriage in the Bible, the Social and Literary Context, that's the name of his book. It came out in 2002 and it's having a huge impact. There's a lot of people that are on board with David Instone Brewer's view. I spent a lot of time, so many hours looking at his work and reading reviews and scholarly papers and all this kind of stuff to try to figure out if I shared that view or not. In the end, I find that he has tons of great insights, and I did use many of his insights, and his access to primary sources that he gives you is really good, but I don't agree with his central argument. And so for that reason, you may just want to skip this section. That's fine. There's a video map down below, as I've mentioned several times, but this is my response to David Instone Brewer's work in particular. Forgive me if I don't give it the rigor that it deserves. I'm certainly trying. And the thing is, his case is long and drawn out, and I'm trying to summarize it, which is always a challenge. But basically, David Instone Brewer, his case is like a 5-link chain. And if every link in the chain is intact, then his conclusion works. But if any of the links aren't intact, if any one of the links fails, then his conclusion also fails. And we can still find exceptions, but we don't find them the way he does. And that would be my view. So let me give you the 5 links, and then we'll talk about after that, after I make his case so you can understand it, then we'll talk about issues with those links. It's based on Exodus chapter 21, verses 10 and 11. Instone Brewer, his actual argument goes something like this: that Exodus 21, verses 10 and 11, it gives 3 additional grounds for divorce beyond sexual immorality. Now, I've argued for grounds like extreme abuse, driving your spouse away. Those were all grounds for divorce. But David Instone Brewer is going to use these 2 verses to establish additional grounds. So,
all right. So I just want to mention, I agree with Mike here that David Instone Brewer's conclusion I can't agree with. His book does have some interesting insights in it, so I appreciate it from that perspective. But Exodus 21 has nothing to do with New Testament divorce and remarriage. But anyway, we'll continue.
So he says, if the scripture says here, if he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. Those 3 things: food, clothing, and marital rights. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. This is speaking here about a servant, a woman who is a servant, who's a hired servant, but she's been married to the man, so she's elevated to the role of wife. Well, he marries a second wife.
All right, he calls her a servant. She's a slave wife, is what's going on. The guy bought her from her dad, who's probably dirt poor, had no better option, so he sold his daughter to a rich guy. That's what's going on.
If he diminishes, she has a case for divorce if he gets rid of her food, clothing, or marital rights. David makes a case for this being material needs, food and clothing, and marital rights referring to emotional neglect, including sexual neglect. So that's his first link. He's going to say that then the Jews of Jesus's time, they would take this Exodus 21 and they would interpret it this way. Hey, if the slave woman can go free for those three reasons, then certainly the free woman can. Hey, if a free woman can go free, then certainly a man can go free. And this is
okay. This is like really, nobody was writing this at the time. You can't find anybody writing this. David Stone Brewer asserts this. Oh, they must have reasoned this way. Well, it'd be nice to find some text that would tell us they reasoned that way, and there is no text. Nobody says that this is the way in which they reasoned. And then, yeah, so it doesn't work, but we'll continue.
This is what David calls Dr. Stone Brewer calls it the argument from the lesser to the greater. And he says the rabbis would have all viewed it this way. And it's like when Paul says, if you don't muzzle an ox, then you don't starve the minister of the gospel. It's like arguing from the lesser to the greater. Hey, if it's true of a slave woman, if she has these rights, then certainly everybody does. Now, he's going to say that all the Jews, his second link in the chain, all the Jews believe this, especially and particularly, and most importantly, the school of Shammai. The Shammaites in the debate with the Hillelites, that not only sexual immorality or unchastity was grounds for divorce, but so was lack of material or emotional sexual treatment of your spouse. His third link in the chain is this, and all these links I think are essential for his case to get through. His third link is that in the recorded debates in the Mishnah, the debate I put up earlier for you between the Hillelites and the Shammaites, I'm going to go ahead and bring it up again. That's not it. They don't talk about these other reasons for divorce. They don't even mention them. And the reason why, those three things, basically material or emotional neglect, marital neglect, that those things are not included in this debate is because they all were assumed. The Shammaites assumed them, the Hillelites assumed them. And then they're just debating Deuteronomy 24, right? They're not talking about what they already agree on. Then the fourth link in the chain, number 4, is that if the school of Shammai allowed for divorce for Exodus 21, then Jesus, who sounds a lot like them, probably did too. So then we have Jesus, it's just assumed because of his culture and time that he also held those views.
Okay, Jesus does not sound like the Shammaites. Shammaites were basing their view on Deuteronomy 24. Jesus is basing his view on Genesis. Jesus sounds like the Damascus document, not like the Shammaites. We're not supposed to be drafting Jesus into the camp with the Pharisees. That's not how this works.
Then the fifth link in the chain, the final chain, which it does have to have every link, is that Stone Brewer is going to go through all the different texts in the New Testament to try to read them and to conform them with the idea that everyone reading and writing these texts is assuming that material or emotional neglect is grounds for divorce. So as far as my analysis, to the best of my ability, having spent a lot of time on the topic, I think that there are problems with link number 2, link number 4, and link number 5 with David and Stone Brewer's case. Let me just walk through them real quick. Link number 2 is the question, do the Shammaites really hold, the school of Shammai, do they really hold to these Exodus 21 based exceptions? And I think here the problem with the link here is that there's just insufficient data. On my reading of David and Stone Brewer's book, it seems like we have enough reason to question this. I'll give you 3 points on that. One, though it seems that many Jews did use those things from Exodus 21, they used those types of things as justification for divorce, it isn't clear that the school of Shammai held that view. Number 2, info from the Mishnah that we do have about marriage and divorce is often hard to trace back to the early 1st century and even harder to put into the opinions of the school of Shammai. Much of the stuff in the Mishnah comes from after 70 AD, and according to Stone Brewer, by that time, the school of Shammai was, quote, all but wiped out. So it's not enough to say in the Mishnah they use Exodus 21 exceptions for divorce, and therefore the school of Shammai held that view. In reality, in the Mishnah, them saying that doesn't put it on the lips of the school of Shammai, unless in the Mishnah it says the school of Shammai says ... And that leads to the third problem with link number 2, which is this: the actual quotes from the school of Shammai in Stone Brewer's book and in the Talmud. And I read big chunks of the Talmud to kind of help me come to this conclusion. They don't give us reason to think that they actually held to Exodus 21 based exceptions. I'm not saying they absolutely didn't, but it doesn't give us grounds for saying they did hold those views. When you read about Shammai, specifically his school, I don't get that. And I'm not the only one who said this. One of the scholars who was reviewing David and Stone Brewer's work actually pointed this out. And I made the mistake of not, I read so many reviews of his stuff, I made the mistake of not saving that one in particular. But they pointed out the same.
Let me just say, that's really easy to do when you read a bunch of stuff and you're like, somebody said this, I don't remember who it was. You have to go back and try to find it. It can be kind of hard.
They said, look, you're reading too much into the school of Shammai. We can't affirm link 2 very confidently that the Shemites really held to these Exodus 21 based exceptions. Now that maybe I'm wrong there. That's my current position on that view. If I'm wrong, this doesn't change my case against Stone Brewer that much, against his case, not him personally. Seems like a great guy. The fourth link, and one that I have an exception with, is: does Jesus really side with the Shemaites in such a way as to make us think he agrees with their other views that he's not talking about? So let's suppose the Shemaites did think these Exodus 21 exceptions were a thing. Does Jesus side with them in such a way to think Jesus agrees with that too? And here I'm going to say, I don't think so. I think the answer is no. Jesus actually disagrees with Shammai in some important areas. For one, he doesn't think any matter divorces, the Hillelite any matter divorce, that those are valid even if achieved by a court. This is not a Shemaiite view at all. He's like, look, the Shemaites, according to in Stone Brewer, would marry someone who was divorced through a Hillelite school or Hillelite court. But this is not the case with Jesus. He's like, hey, you were divorced wrongly. Your remarriage is adultery. That's not something that the Shemaites would have agreed with, it seems. 2, Jesus doesn't appeal to Deuteronomy or Exodus to establish his principle. What we're doing is we're saying that, hey, in another passage in the Law of Moses, there's more justifications for adultery. So then Jesus would have affirmed that, or for adultery, for divorce and remarriage, excuse me. But Jesus actually sidesteps the issue of what Moses permitted. And he gives us a priority of Genesis 1 and 2, showing that the permission in Deuteronomy 24 was not a justification.
Okay, so I agree with Mike that David and Stone Brewer's case just does not work. Exodus 21 was putting a limitation on the horrors of slavery. A slave wife doesn't include real consent, and so morally those aren't really marriages anyway. But I appreciate David and Stone Brewer that David and Stone Brewer agrees that Jesus gave the same argument that is in the Damascus document. But David and Stone Brewer is really interesting because his end conclusion is like more permissive than me, more permissive than Mike. But because he has this kind of Exodus 21 way that he gets to a more permissive conclusion, he is not afraid of saying, well, yeah, Jesus was giving the same argument as was in the Damascus document, because he thinks Jesus was giving that argument only to refute Deuteronomy 24 based divorces and remarriages. So that's David and Stone Brewer's acknowledgement. Yeah, Deuteronomy 24 stuff, we're overriding that. But we're not overriding Exodus 21. We're going to continue down that road. But when you analyze the Exodus 21, trying to import that into the New Testament for regular marriages, that just does not. It totally falls apart. Now, Mike did say something here I really agreed with, that Jesus is not basing his teaching on Exodus or on Deuteronomy. Jesus is not interpreting Deuteronomy 24. He's not applying the same standard as Deuteronomy 24. Jesus is not appealing to the regulation. He's appealing to the beginning. Since there was no divorce in the beginning, there is no divorce now. So this is important because it underlines Mike's point that Jesus is not giving the Shammai view. Now, Mike tries to say it kind of both ways, frankly. He says that Jesus is basically siding with Shammai, right? But then he says Shammai based their views on Deuteronomy, and Jesus is not. So Jesus is not giving the Shammai view. But this is why evangelicalism should just kind of let go of the association of Jesus teaching like the Shammai view. If you read what Jesus says and what Shammai says and what the Damascus document says, you take those three things: Jesus, Shammai, Damascus document. You look at those three. Two of these are the same, and one of them is an outlier, and the outlier is Shammai. Shammai doesn't match the Damascus document. Shammai doesn't match Jesus. Jesus in the Damascus document, they match. And so that's why evangelicalism should like let go of this. Jesus is giving this like a Shammai adjacent view. Again, Shammai's view on divorce is nowhere represented in the New Testament. What you see in Matthew 19, 3 through 12, what you see there is the Hillel view versus the Damascus document view. Those are the only two views on the New Testament on divorce and remarriage.
I think that we can project Jesus' statement about Deuteronomy to Exodus 21. It seems that it was, even if it was permission in Exodus 21, it doesn't mean it's justification. So it seems wrong to base exceptions on rabbinic use of Exodus passages when Jesus comes against using the law of Moses as justification for divorce in the first place. If we assume Jesus is consistent, he might respond to Exodus 21 the same way he responded to Deuteronomy 24. If in my view, he's not interpreting Deuteronomy 24, he's just offering a ruling of his own that is based upon maybe God having divorced Israel for adultery. If that's the case, then it's not based upon how we interpret Exodus 21 or Deuteronomy 24. That's not to say that Jesus's rule can't have any exceptions at all. That's not what I'm saying. Obviously, I've given several. It's just that we don't get them by importing Exodus 21 into the back.
Okay, so we have a problem here. So Mike wants to use Jeremiah 3 as the basis for Jesus permitting divorce and remarriage for adultery. And so he doesn't want to use Deuteronomy 24 for that because he says, well, Jesus is not really applying Deuteronomy 24. Maybe he's applying Jeremiah 3. Here's the problem with that. Jeremiah 3 gets its adultery exception from Deuteronomy chapter 24. If you read Jeremiah chapter 3:1, it's an appeal back to the Deuteronomy 24:1 law. So you can't do this. Well, Jesus is using Jeremiah, but not using Deuteronomy. Jeremiah 3 is appealing back to Deuteronomy. Jesus specifically rejects using the Deuteronomy 24 as the basis of his rule on divorce and remarriage. He rejects it specifically in Matthew 19:8, where he says that was for hard-heartedness. So saying Jesus appealed to Jeremiah 3, even though it's not even in the gospel text anywhere, but to say that is to say Jesus appealed to Deuteronomy 24. You can't really do one without the other. But Jesus, of course, was rejecting using Deuteronomy 24 as the basis of his teaching. And so the Jeremiah 3 appeal doesn't work.
Ground of Jesus' statements and opinions. And then finally, the last link that I would disagree with David and Stone Brewer on is link 5. The link 5, the idea that take this view and read it consistently with the statements of the New Testament by saying, oh, in the background, they're affirming, extra 3 more reasons for divorce that they're not mentioning, and they're specific reasons. I don't think that that's the case. So this is the same reason, by the way, I reject the no remarriage view. I don't think you can marry it with scripture very well. Let me give you one example from Stone Brewer's book. So his treatment of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 3, I'm going to read it to you now. Hold on, I'll put the verse up for you first. Keep in mind, for his final link to work, he has to take all this theory about Jesus and then say, and when you read the New Testament texts, even if it's not explicit in there, at least it won't conflict with what I'm saying. Well, unfortunately, I think it does. But 1 Corinthians 7:3 shows that there's just not a very good handling, I think, of the text in this case at this later stage of him developing his argument. 1 Corinthians 7:3 says the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. Now, let me quote David and Stone Brewer from his book. He says, this present study and a few others have also pointed out the affirmation of the grounds for divorce in Exodus 21:10-11 by the use of that text in 1 Corinthians 7:3. Now, here's where I get lost. I don't think that Paul is using Exodus 21 in 1 Corinthians 7:3. It does say the wife should give, we should give each other our conjugal rights. It does say that. And that concept is in Exodus 21. That's true. But is he using Exodus 21? Not only that.
Definitely, there's no Exodus 21 stuff going on here at all. And it just says what people should do. It doesn't say, if they don't, you can divorce. It doesn't say that. So, it's just not a connection at all.
David and Stone Brewer doesn't just say there's a connection between 1 Corinthians 7:3 and Exodus 21. He says, that he's pointing out, quote, the affirmation of the grounds for divorce in Exodus 21. So he's taking 1 Corinthians 7:3 as kind of like a way of saying, see, and you can divorce if they don't give you your conjugal rights. And I don't think that fits 1 Corinthians 7 at all. It seems like total eisegesis to me. So this is a really crucial point, and it's under-supported in David and Stone Brewer's case. I think that the fifth link doesn't actually work. Yeah. Now, let me offer a caveat. I do think it's dangerous neglect of material needs or extreme emotional abuse can be grounds for divorce. I just don't use David and Stone Brewer's theory to get there. That's not my way of getting there. And when he gets there with a lot more flexibility in when you can divorce than I would. So there's my quick, I know that took a little bit, but it's actually my very quick analysis of his stuff. There's so much more in every issue. And it's actually a fascinating book.
That was actually a pretty good quick summary, because there's a lot in his David and Stone Brewer's book. That was a pretty good summary.
And I've linked it below, and you guys can check it out if you like. Next question. Should a pastor marry someone who's wrongly divorced? As a pastor, I think that the right answer is no. I think you should not marry someone who is wrongly divorced. Now, maybe they were wrongly divorced, and then subsequent things have happened in the intermediate period where now the divorce is like legitimate, morally legitimate. That's one thing. But I mean, who's currently wrongly divorced? I think the answer is absolutely not. I think that our calling for them is that they get rid of any other relationships, they get their life right with the Lord in every way, and then they try to seek for restoration if possible. If it was an invalid divorce reason, they're still morally obligated to their spouse. That was one of our first principles. Also, there's a huge danger, Christian. You're thinking about marrying somebody who was unjustifiably divorced and choosing.
So here's what I would say. So if somebody is divorced, whether you whatever the reason is, and their prior valid spouse is alive, they should not get remarried at all if their prior spouse is alive. Now, I will say this. There are a couple things you want to check. Was the prior marriage actually a valid marriage? It is possible. For example, let's say a man marries a divorced woman, and then they get divorced, and now the man wants to go marry somebody else. Well, if all you find out is he was previously married, you don't actually have enough information to be able to say that he can or can't remarry. You need to actually ask a follow-up question. Well, was your previous spouse previously married? And if so, then you have to ask another question about, well, did her previous husband, first of all, was that a valid marriage? You do have to ask these questions, and you have to find out, was he alive? Has he passed away? When did he pass away? If he passed away during their marriage, then at the time he passed away, his first marriage became a real marriage because she was not free to marry, and she met all the other qualifications to be married to this guy that you're talking to. So now that is a valid marriage. But if he died after they divorced, then their first marriage, this man's first marriage who you're talking to wants to find out if he can remarry, his first marriage was never valid, so he could go ahead and remarry. So you do have to kind of ask these questions to figure out, was the marriage valid or not? And that's just because our human way of thinking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage is so different than what the truth is, that we're running these different narratives of were we married, were we not married. We have to kind of get all our facts together and try to figure out what actually was going on in that particular situation. Some people, I just want to address an objection. Some people are going to say, Chris, that is so complicated. How could we ever possibly do all of that kind of math and gymnastics and who died when and all that stuff? And the truth of the matter is, it is not nearly as complicated as Mike's view. Mike's view is impossibly complicated. There are line drawing questions all over the place. Husband and wife are married. Wife claims he cheated. She divorces. Now she wants to be able to remarry. When you say he cheated, what do you mean exactly? Well, he was doing this, he was doing that. Now, does that constitute porneia in the exception clause? 3 hands says it does, 4 hands says it doesn't. No, you can't remarry. And why is it 4-3? Because there is no clear, bright line rule of what constitutes adultery and what does not in kind of the gray areas. And then you have this other question. Let's say they both were doing things that were qualify as porneia. Now they divorce, can they remarry? The Westminster Confession of Faith view would say the innocent party could go ahead and remarry. Well, if they're both doing bad stuff, can they both remarry, or can they neither one of them remarry? The Westminster Confession of Faith view, my understanding is, would say that only the innocent could remarry, and so if they're both guilty, then neither one could remarry, right? And now you have another problem, which is, this is just what she told you. you don't know if it's true. And yes, people do lie. They don't always tell you the truth. You don't have subpoena power from the state to find out what actually happened or not. So you're like taking their word for it. And then you're going to go ahead and perform a remarriage based on the word of somebody who may or may not be telling you the truth. How well do you know them? And people, when it gets into marriage and all that kind of stuff, people will exaggerate. They'll, yeah, and Mike talks about this, how people will exaggerate things in their own mind, and they'll like hype themselves up, and they'll really believe, oh, I was really a victim here, and they'll portray it in a certain kind of really negative light. And then you really have to question them, and oh, you're re-victimizing me by asking me all these questions. It's just, if you think my way of looking at it is complicated, just try Mike's way. Mike's way is way more complicated. Mine, at least, is based on like concrete records. You can actually nail down dates and figure out what happened, and you're not going to be swayed by, the testimony of this person and things they said that were not true, and it's a whole total mess. So, and also, like, you usually can't get both sides of the story. I mean, if the other guy's gone somewhere and she's in New York and he's in California, good luck getting him to like get on the phone, and what are you going to interview him and find out he doesn't want to talk to you about what happened in their marriage? So you can't get both sides of the story. So you're just taking her accusation, but you don't. But the accused doesn't get his say in court about like what happens. So you can kind of get down to the bottom of it. Mike's interpretation, this is the common evangelical view, is a total mess. It is totally unworkable. And what ends up happening is they just do divorce and remarriages, and they just like let it go. That's pretty much what ends up happening, because it's a totally unworkable system. So my system, the way I understand the text, and this is, I don't have this view because it's like easier to apply in real life. I would never interpret the scripture because, oh, this is easier. I don't do that. But it does happen to be the fact that it is much easier to go ahead and apply. And so that really wouldn't be a good objection. If you're going to say that my way is too complicated, Mike's way is way more complicated.
Now to marry another person, like, you're probably going to divorce them too, or they'll divorce you. The same unresolved issues that have them rooted in bitterness and unforgiveness with their previous spouse are going to crop up in your marriage, almost guaranteed. This is a real dangerous situation. If there's been repentance and honest attempts to restore, and the other person will not allow for restoration, then they're in the 1 Corinthians 7:15 situation. Then okay, they're free, and they may now get married. And of course, as a pastor, there's a concern that someone's just lying to me. What if they're tricking me and they don't have justified divorce? I mean, I'm not a cop. I'm not just going to assume everyone's guilty to prove their guilt. Like, that's an interrogation technique. Like, I'm not, like, as a pastor, that's not really the right direction to go. That deceit is on them, not on you as a pastor. So if you have reason to think that, the divorce is legitimate, then you can do the marriage, in my opinion, for what it's worth. Now, what I want to do is a quick summary of all of the 15 biblical principles, and then I want to add principle 16 to it. So here are all of them on the screen. I'm just going to read through them because, boy, oh boy, in the 75-hour-long video that you are currently watching, it's easy to get lost in the mix. These are the principles, modified appropriately. Marriage is a union that God created, therefore we should keep it together. Number 2, divorce, as a general rule, is wrong and should not be done. 3, divorce that is unjustified, coupled with remarriage, is adultery.
I would just say that divorce and remarriage is adultery. There's no such thing as a remarriage that is not adultery because of the reason for the divorce. There he said unjustified divorce, and the implication there is that justified divorce then also means you can have a remarriage, which he has said multiple times. And I would say that there is no such thing as a divorce reason that would then also permit remarriage. You can remarry after your former spouse dies, or if your first marriage was invalid because it was an adulterous remarriage, but you can't remarry because your spouse was a bad person and you divorced them because they were a bad person. That doesn't grant permission to remarry. Remarriage in that situation would be a continual state of adultery that ought to be divorced.
Divorce, number 4, divorce that is unjustified, doesn't end the moral obligation of the marriage.
So I would say that no divorce ends the marriage. He says unjustified divorce doesn't end the moral obligation. I don't think it's just a moral obligation. I think it is the marriage, actually. And we know that because Jesus calls remarriages adultery. For a remarriage to be adultery, the person who got remarried would have to be married. You can't commit adultery unless you're married. So the divorce doesn't end the marriage at all, which is why the remarriage would be adultery. And that's the case in every divorce. Now, if there's an invalid marriage, you divorce that the divorce doesn't really end a marriage because there never was a marriage. You're just kind of changing, you're updating the records to be correct.
Means that you need to go back and seek reconciliation. Number 5, sexual sin can justify a divorce. Number 6,
I disagree. Sexual sin does not justify divorce.
sexual sin can also justify a remarriage. Number 7,
Sexual sin does not justify remarriage. Jesus, in fact, specifically rejects divorce and remarriage for adultery in Matthew 19, 7 and 8.
and staying single to better serve the Lord is a good option. Number
True.
8, if your spouse dies, you are free to marry another.
True.
Something a lot of church fathers actually rejected. Number 9, are you the cause of unjustified divorce? Stay single or be reconciled. That's 1 Corinthians 7.
I agree with that, but I would say if you're divorced, not it's justified or unjustified, or if you're the cause or the other person's the cause, it doesn't matter. If you're divorced, be single or be reconciled to your spouse. That's assuming the divorce was of a valid marriage. If the divorce was of an invalid marriage, then the person can go ahead and remarry because they were never actually married to begin with. But if somebody was in a valid marriage and they were divorced, whatever the reason, whoever caused it, none of that matters. If they were in a valid marriage and they were divorced, then they should be single or be reconciled back to their first spouse until that spouse passes away. Once that spouse passes away, then they're free to remarry.
Number 10, if an unbeliever wants to depart, then the believer is free from the marriage and free to remarry.
If two people are married and one abandons the other, then the one who was abandoned now is now unencumbered, and they're now able to serve God by not being slowed down and held back by that presumably difficult relationship. In that sense, they're not enslaved. That is, they're not encumbered, as 1 Corinthians 7:21 teaches us, that once somebody is freed from this difficult relationship, they're now able to go ahead and serve God better, which is what the Corinthians wanted to do in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. However, it does not mean when somebody's abandoned that they're able to remarry. They're not able to remarry. A remarriage would be adultery. What they're free to be able to do is what the Corinthians wanted to do, which is to serve God.
11, Jesus' rule may have exceptions not explicitly mentioned.
Incorrect. There are no exceptions that allow remarriage after a divorce of a valid marriage while the prior spouse is still living.
Therefore, we can be open to unique circumstances, and this includes all the weirdness of life and stuff that you never thought of and didn't even know could happen until you heard a story. Number 12, the rule for unbelievers from 1 Corinthians 7, principle number 10, the rule for unbelievers can be applied to proclaim believers if they can be biblically treated as unbelievers, meaning they won't listen to Jesus or the church.
Okay, technically, I agree with this, but I don't agree with what he means by it. So I technically agree with his words. That is, not enslaved would apply to a believer who's acting like an unbeliever. The difference is that I think not enslaved in verse 15 means not encumbered by that marriage. So now you're able to go ahead and serve God better because you're not held back by that challenging marriage. And that would apply whether the person was a believer or a non-believer when you go through that church discipline process. So I agree with that. But what Mike means by it is now there's an additional exception that allows a believer to be able to remarry after their professing believing spouse leaves them. And of course, this is a huge contradiction because the claim there is that Jesus was only speaking about believer-believer marriages. Paul in verses 12 and following in 1 Corinthians 7 was about believer-unbeliever marriages, if you remember that. And so the idea is that in verse 15, we have an exception that allows a believer to remarry after a believer or an unbeliever abandons them, right? This is how they get there through the church discipline process, by treating the believing spouse as an unbelieving spouse. Of course, the problem with this is then, if Jesus was talking about believer-believer marriages and Jesus had an exception clause there, why didn't Jesus then also include an exception for abandonment? The lack of exception for abandonment would mean to Jesus' audience at the time, you cannot remarry in the case of abandonment. So even if, for some reason, somehow, Jesus' audience thought he was talking only about believer-believer marriages, which is also like impossible for them to have thought that. But let's suppose they thought that. They would have thought after the end of a believer-believer marriage, the abandoned spouse cannot remarry. Nobody would have thought they could remarry. And so this principle that Mike has here, the way he understands it, makes Paul to contradict with Jesus.
13, radical danger or harm justifies separation and possibly divorce.
I agree with that.
I think it's a process, but yeah, it would eventually justify divorce. And it would be on the person because they are the one who drove you out. So the separation is on them, not you. 14, any behavior causing proper separation can, if reconciliation is refused by the offender's continued acts, properly lead to divorce, because this is in effect the same as the 1 Corinthians 7:15 scenario. Number 15, anyone properly free from a marriage is also free to remarry if they choose. And
Okay, so I suppose theoretically, if it were possible to dissolve a marriage, then yes, a person could remarry if they could dissolve a marriage. The problem is, in my understanding of the scripture, there is no way to dissolve a marriage prior to death. It is impossible to do so. So yeah, theoretically, I suppose in fantasy land, if you could dissolve a marriage, then yes, a person could remarry then because they wouldn't be cheating on anybody because the marriage is dissolved. But again, I don't think you can dissolve a marriage prior to death. Therefore, that would never actually work. So as long as a prior valid spouse is alive, a remarriage is always a continual state of adultery.
number 16, Christians should unilaterally fulfill, this is my last principle for us, and it's my final thought I want to give you. Christians should unilaterally fulfill our calling to serve Christ through fully obeying God's commands to husbands and or wives. Unilateral, you know what that means? You do it when they don't. That's your calling. That is your calling as a Christian. Exceptions exist, but they are abused. That's true. Jesus' extreme statements get to the heart of the issue. What God has joined together, man should not separate. You should seek to follow Christ. And I again point you to my teaching on to husbands and wives individually. I really recommend. I had a couple tell me that it saved their marriage when they watched those videos, and I hope that it would bless yours. But this last principle that Christians should unilaterally, I'll put it up here, unilaterally fulfill our calling to serve Christ through obeying God's commands to husbands or wives. It means you change first. Breaking the cardinal rule of American marriages, you change first. You do not require them to be good for you to be right with God. No Christian will think clearly. No Christian will think clearly about divorce until they've given over to the lordship of Christ in their marriage. That's where you start. Right now, I encourage you to pray, to seek the Lord, to honor Christ with that marriage, so that if you have a divorce, it is truly appropriate and proper. There are bad reasons for divorce, and I want to kind of add this at the end here. Here's some bad reasons to get a divorce. I'm not happy. I hate them. We've grown apart. I'm bitter. I'm just over them, and I won't change. They have repented, but I will not forgive them. Or God told me it's okay, even though it doesn't seem like it's okay to anybody who knows the Bible. God is not going to contradict himself. I'll take scripture over your impressions, and you should too. Those are obviously bad reasons for a divorce. So my conviction is that the fullness of the teaching of scripture on this topic gives us a fuller understanding that gives us the rule, as well as the ability to have exceptions that are legitimate with compassion, and to pick up the messy pieces of our lives and follow Christ moving forward. I think all of scripture speaks to it, which is why I made a 300-hour video to talk about all of scripture on it. You have questions. I get it. There's things I didn't cover. There's things maybe I got wrong or didn't explain well enough. Ask your questions. Again, I remind you, put them in the comments, vote up the ones that you agree with, that you're like, yes, answer that. And I will make a follow-up video just answering your questions and pushback. I will do that. And if I'm wrong, I will on something that I discover it, I'll admit it in that video very happily. After that, I'm going to do a final third video on marriage and divorce and remarriage. And it's going to be a short video, the video you wish I would have made just now, right? Where it's just real short, boom, boom, boom. Simple teaching. I'm not going to do a debate, just a straightforward teaching as quick as I can handle it, going through the topic. I think that between those three videos, I should answer this question well enough that at least no one can say I wasn't thorough. So that's about it. We hope you've enjoyed this 7,000 hour long video, and I hope that it's been a blessing to you and that it's helped equip you for your own life and to help others through the struggles that they're dealing with. God bless you.
Okay, so I basically put in the entire video from Mike Winger there and throughout this playlist. You can go ahead and watch that, all that if you haven't already. I think Mike is a great guy. I encourage people to watch his content on other subjects. I disagree with him on divorce and remarriage. I believe marriage is permanent. It's indissoluble until death. Remarriage, after a divorce of a marriage, remarriage is a continual state of adultery as long as that first spouse is still alive. I think the exception clause in Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9 are not allowing a divorce of a valid marriage. What Jesus there is talking about if somebody is invalidly married, they can go ahead and end that invalid marriage, and then they could remarry. And the reason for the invalidity would be that they married like a divorced person. And so Matthew 5:32b, the second half of Matthew 5:32, is an explanation of the exception clause. The idea there is a man married a divorced woman as an invalid marriage, and so the man could divorce her, and he could go ahead and remarry in that particular situation. Go ahead, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know your thoughts, and make sure you get my book, Divorce Your Remarriage. You get that at Amazon.com. I have a link to it in the description below, and we'll see you guys next time.